The war was not misunderstood. That is the first thing you have to accept before any of this makes sense. The popular version of history, the one that settled into documentary films and museum plaques and political speeches, frames Vietnam as a tragedy of miscalculation. A war that well-meaning men stumbled into without proper knowledge, without proper maps, without a proper theory of victory. That version is comforting because it preserves the assumption that the system worked the way it was supposed to work, that information flowed honestly upward through chains of command, that the men at the top were doing their best with what they had. That version is wrong. What the archives show, when you move through them carefully, is not a failure of understanding. It is a failure of honesty, and those are not the same thing at all. The men who designed American strategy in Vietnam were not ignorant of the country or its history. By the time the first large combat formations arrived in 1965, the United States had been operating inside Vietnam in one form or another for nearly 2 decades. Intelligence agencies had produced thousands of pages of analysis. Diplomatic cables had traced the contours of the conflict with considerable accuracy. Academic specialists had warned repeatedly and in writing that a war of attrition against a guerrilla force embedded in a civilian population was not a war that could be won by conventional measures, not in any time frame that political reality would permit. Those warnings were read. They were filed. They were occasionally cited in internal documents. And then, the people who read them went ahead and built the exact system those warnings had predicted would fail. You have to sit with that for a moment. The architecture of failure was not accidental. It was constructed piece by piece with considerable effort by people who had access to better information and chose not to use it. The question of why they made that choice is not a simple one, and the archives do not give you a single clean answer. What they give you instead is a picture of institutional momentum, of careers built on particular assumptions, of budget cycles and procurement contracts, and inter-service rivalries that had their own logic entirely separate from the logic of the war itself. The war in Vietnam was, among other things, a machine for producing institutional justification, and institutional machines do not stop easily, not even when the people running them know the output is wrong. The first reality embedded in the classified record, the one that everything else flows from, is about body counts. Not about whether the numbers were inflated, because that is already well established and not particularly interesting on its own. What is interesting is the mechanism by which inflation happened, and what that mechanism tells you about the entire structure of American military culture in that period. The body count was not a metric that was imposed on unwilling commanders from above. It emerged gradually from a doctrinal commitment to quantification that predated Vietnam entirely and had its roots in the defense management reforms of the early 1960s. Robert McNamara had come to the Pentagon from the Ford Motor Company, where statistical control had been the instrument of post-war industrial transformation. He believed, with genuine conviction, that any system could be made legible through the right numbers, and that legibility was the precondition for rational management. His team of analysts, the people who came to be called the whiz kids, applied that framework to military operations. If you could measure outputs, you could optimize them. If you could optimize them, you could win. The problem was that the outputs available for measurement in a guerrilla war were not the outputs that mattered. Territory held was not a useful metric when the enemy had no permanent territory to hold. Weapons captured was not a useful metric when the enemy could resupply through a supply line that moved at night along jungle paths no aircraft could target reliably. Enemy killed was the metric that remained because it was concrete, it was verifiable in principle, and it fit neatly into attrition theory, the idea that if you killed enough of the enemy, you would eventually exhaust their capacity to fight. What nobody could measure was the rate at which the enemy was replacing his losses, or the degree to which the war was producing its own recruits through the very violence being conducted in its name. So the body count became the primary measure of progress. And once it became the primary measure of progress, the entire incentive structure of the military hierarchy aligned behind it. Officers were evaluated in part on the numbers their units produced. Units that produced high numbers received commendations. Units that produced low numbers attracted scrutiny. This was not a secret. It was visible in how promotion boards operated, in how after-action reports were written, in how commanders in the field talked to each other. The incentive was there. It was real. And it produced exactly the behavior you would expect from any system where rewards are tied to metrics that can be manipulated. The inflation was not always dramatic. In many cases, it was incremental, the result of hundreds of small decisions made under pressure, under ambiguity, under the normal human desire to make a bad situation look marginally better than it was. A patrol returns from contact and reports 6 enemy dead. The actual count might be 3 confirmed, with blood trails suggesting others who had been carried away. The report says 6. A company commander receives his subordinates' reports and aggregates them upward. He rounds in the direction of optimism. The battalion commander does the same. By the time the numbers reach Saigon, they have passed through 4 or 5 layers of rounding, each increment small enough to seem defensible, the cumulative effect large enough to be operationally meaningless. By the mid-1960s, the kill ratio being reported from Vietnam was high enough that if the numbers were accurate, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong should have been approaching military exhaustion. They were not approaching military exhaustion. Tet would demonstrate this with considerable clarity in early 1968, when an enemy force that official metrics had described as weakening launched the largest coordinated offensive of the war. But that is the public version, the one that made the evening news. Inside the classified record, people had known the numbers were wrong for years before Tet. The Defense Intelligence Agency had produced internal assessments questioning the validity of enemy casualty figures as early as 1966. The CIA had run its own independent analysis of enemy order of battle and consistently reached higher estimates than the military was willing to accept. There was a direct confrontation, documented in cables and memoranda, between military intelligence in Saigon and civilian analysts in Washington over how many enemy troops were actually in the field. The military position was that the number had to remain below a certain threshold because acknowledging a higher number would imply that the war was not being won. This argument, the argument that the enemy order of battle could not be what the evidence suggested because political inconvenience required otherwise, was made explicitly in writing by senior officials. It was not a matter of honest disagreement about methodology. It was a deliberate decision to suppress an uncomfortable finding. Sam Adams, the CIA analyst who documented this confrontation most carefully, was not a radical or a dissident in the way the term is normally understood. He was a career intelligence professional who believed that his job was to tell the truth about what the evidence showed. He discovered that the truth about enemy troop strength was substantially different from what the military was reporting, compiled his evidence, brought it to his superiors, and found himself in the middle of an institutional war in which his findings were inconvenient to too many powerful people for them to be officially accepted. The classified record of his dispute with the military intelligence establishment, portions of which eventually became public through congressional investigations and his own memoir, is a document about how institutions protect themselves from accurate information when accurate information would require them to change their behavior. Adams eventually left the agency. The numbers he had disputed continued to be used for several more years as the basis for official assessments of enemy strength. The war continued on the foundation of those numbers. There is a second reality in the archive that concerns the nature of the enemy being fought, and it is in some ways more disorienting than the body count falsification because it involves not institutional cynicism, but genuine confusion. The American military arrived in Vietnam with a framework for understanding communist insurgency that had been derived primarily from the Greek Civil War and the Malayan Emergency, conflicts that had geographic and political characteristics quite different from those of Vietnam. The framework assumed a relatively clear distinction between the guerrilla organization and the civilian population from which it drew support, and it assumed that if you could separate the population from the guerrillas through a combination of physical security and political development, the insurgency would wither. This was the strategic theory behind the entire pacification effort, behind the strategic Hamlet program, behind the civil operations and revolutionary development support program that consumed enormous resources throughout the war. The evidence in the classified record suggests that many of the people implementing this strategy understood, at least privately, that the framework did not fit the reality. The relationship between the National Liberation Front and the rural population of South Vietnam was not simply one of coercion. It was substantially one of genuine political support, built over 2 decades of organizing, rooted in grievances against landlords and local officials and the colonial administrative structures the Diem government had inherited and perpetuated. You cannot separate a population from a political movement that the population has chosen, even imperfectly and under pressure, to support. You can terrorize the population into passivity, which is a different thing entirely from winning their loyalty. You can move the population, which is what the strategic Hamlet program attempted. But moving people does not move the political relationships they carry with them. The field reports from province advisors, the Americans who lived in the countryside and worked alongside South Vietnamese officials, contain some of the most candid assessments available about the political reality of the war. These reports, many of which were classified and circulated only within the advisory system, describe in clinical detail the degree to which the South Vietnamese government was unable to command the loyalty of its own rural citizens, the degree to which local officials were corrupt or ineffective or both, the degree to which American development assistance was being diverted before it reached its intended recipients. These reports arrived in Saigon, were summarized, were aggregated into the formal assessments that went to Washington, and in the process, their specific, granular, negative findings were systematically smoothed away. What arrived in Washington was a picture of progress, of Hamlets rated as secure, of loyalty metrics trending upward. What the province advisors were seeing on the ground bore little resemblance to those metrics. The Hamlet evaluation system, which was the formal mechanism for measuring pacification progress, assigned each Hamlet in South Vietnam a letter grade based on a questionnaire administered periodically by American advisors. The system produced a continuous stream of data suggesting that the pacification program was working, that an increasing percentage of the rural population was moving into the secure category. Internal studies of the system's validity, studies that were conducted by the organizations responsible for administering it, found serious methodological problems. The questionnaire was administered by advisors who were under the same institutional pressure to show progress as everyone else in the military hierarchy. The questions themselves were vulnerable to optimistic interpretation. The grades were aggregated in ways that smoothed over local variation. A Hamlet that was quiet during the day when the evaluation was conducted might be a different place entirely after dark. Several internal analyses concluded directly that the Hamlet evaluation system was measuring the reporting of security rather than the reality of it, and that the two had diverged significantly. Those analyses were classified and did not alter the system that continued producing its optimistic numbers. The third reality, closely related to the second, concerns the South Vietnamese military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and the ways in which American assumptions about that force shaped the entire structure of the war effort. The fundamental strategic premise of American involvement in Vietnam was that there was a viable South Vietnamese state worth defending, and that the South Vietnamese military could, with training and equipment and American advice, eventually become capable of defending it independently. This was not simply the public justification for the war, it was the premise that American planners genuinely held, or at least held officially, throughout most of the conflict. The premise was, by most measures of the internal record, wrong from nearly the beginning. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam suffered from structural problems that American training and equipment could not address, because those problems were political rather than military. Leadership positions were distributed on the basis of political loyalty to whoever was currently in power in Saigon, which changed frequently throughout the 1960s rather than on the basis of military competence. Officers who demonstrated too much independent effectiveness were a political threat and were accordingly transferred or marginalized. Officers who were politically reliable were protected regardless of their military performance. The result was a corps of commanders whose primary skill was navigating the internal politics of a government that was itself chronically unstable, and whose relationship to the military mission they nominally led was distant at best. American military advisors documented this situation in detail. The classified advisory files from the early and mid-1960s contain frank assessments of specific commanders, specific units, specific operations that describe in precise terms what was going wrong and why. What those advisors could not do was compel South Vietnamese commanders to perform differently, because the authority to do that rested with the South Vietnamese chain of command, and the South Vietnamese chain of command operated according to political calculations that had little to do with military effectiveness. The advisors could recommend, they could report, they could occasionally shame a commander into temporary improvement. They could not replace him with someone better, because replacing him was a political act that would have consequences reaching all the way to Saigon. American combat forces, when they arrived in large numbers in 1965, effectively took over responsibility for fighting the war, which had the perverse effect of reducing the pressure on the South Vietnamese military to improve. If the Americans were going to fight the main force war, the South Vietnamese could focus on the pacification mission, or could focus on internal politics, or could simply exist as a military structure without being required to perform militarily. When Vietnamization began under the Nixon administration, the attempt to transfer responsibility for the war back to South Vietnamese forces, the fundamental structural problems had not been resolved. They had, if anything, deepened, because the period of American combat responsibility had allowed the South Vietnamese military to atrophy further, while the paper metrics continued to show improvement. The archive contains an assessment, produced in 1972 and still partially classified, of the South Vietnamese military's actual combat capability measured against the capability that official reporting claimed it possessed. The gap between the two was substantial. Units that were reported as combat-ready by official metrics were assessed by analysts who had examined their actual performance in contact with the enemy as being incapable of sustained independent operations against a determined opponent. This assessment was produced after 7 years of intensive American effort to build South Vietnamese military capability, after billions of dollars of equipment transfers, after training programs that had processed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It was not a secret from the people who managed the war. It was filed, classified, and the official program continued. What the archive shows about psychological operations and propaganda is, in its own way, as corrosive as anything in the military record. The United States ran an extensive psychological operations program in Vietnam aimed at both enemy combatants and the South Vietnamese civilian population. The classified record of that program contains material that is instructive about how the American government understood its own mission. The program produced leaflets, radio broadcasts, loudspeaker appeals, all designed to convince their intended audiences of things the program managers either believed or wanted people to believe. Some of what the program broadcast was accurate, some of it was not. The distinction was not always carefully maintained. There were specific programs designed to persuade North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers to defect, offering safe passage and good treatment to anyone who came over. The Chiu Hoi program, which ran throughout most of the war, produced a continuous stream of defectors who were then processed, interrogated, and in some cases used as guides or informants. The program's numbers were reported enthusiastically as evidence of declining enemy morale. The internal assessments of the program's actual strategic impact were considerably more skeptical. A significant portion of those who presented themselves as defectors under the program were found, upon interrogation, to have come in temporarily for reasons unrelated to ideological conversion, rest, access to food, escape from a difficult, immediate tactical situation, and in some cases had returned to their units afterward. The defector numbers were real. What the numbers meant was considerably more ambiguous than the official reporting acknowledged. The propaganda aimed at the South Vietnamese population contained claims about the effectiveness of the South Vietnamese government and the progress of the war that American officials privately knew were not accurate. There were memos, produced within the Psychological Operations Command, that discussed the tension between what the program needed to claim for its messages to be credible and what the evidence about South Vietnamese government performance actually supported. The tension was not resolved in favor of accuracy. The program needed to maintain the credibility of the South Vietnamese government because the program's entire strategic purpose was to generate support for that government. Acknowledging that the government was corrupt, ineffective, and unpopular would have undermined the program's reason for existing. So the program continued to broadcast claims that its own managers did not fully believe, to an audience that in many cases knew the claims were false because they were living with the reality the claims were supposed to describe. There is a category of classified material that concerns the air war in ways that have not fully entered the public record even decades later. The bombing campaigns against North Vietnam, against the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia, against targets in South Vietnam itself, were the most intensive application of aerial firepower in history. The tonnage of bombs dropped in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War exceeded the total tonnage dropped in the entire Second World War. The human cost of that bombing on the populations beneath it was enormous and is still not fully accounted for in American historical memory. What the classified record shows about the air war involves not only the scale of destruction, but the systematic unreliability of the assessment process that was used to justify continuing it. Bomb damage assessment, the process by which the military evaluated what its airstrikes had actually accomplished, was subject to the same institutional pressures that distorted every other metric in the war. Pilots reported what they had dropped and approximately where. Post-strike photography, when available, documented physical damage to structures. But the connection between physical damage to structures and any operationally meaningful outcome was rarely established rigorously. A bridge destroyed and rebuilt within 48 hours by a labor force that had been practicing the task for years was not a strategic achievement. A storage facility destroyed and replaced by dispersed underground storage that was harder to find and harder to destroy was not a strategic achievement. The air campaign against the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was sustained for years at enormous cost and risk to American air crews, was unable to stop the flow of supplies that kept the war going in the South. This was known. Internal assessments of the Trail Interdiction campaign acknowledged that supplies were continuing to move south in quantities sufficient to sustain enemy operations, and that the air campaign was not achieving its stated objective of reducing that flow below operationally significant levels. The campaign continued anyway. The classified record concerning Cambodia is particularly significant and remains imperfectly absorbed into public understanding. The bombing of Cambodia, which began in March of 1969 and continued for 4 years, was initially conducted with extraordinary secrecy. The radar operators and navigators on the B-52s that struck Cambodian targets were given falsified records showing the strikes had occurred in South Vietnam. 2 sets of reports were maintained, the falsified official record and the actual record, which was held in a separate classified system accessible only to those specifically authorized. Officers who discovered the discrepancy and raised concerns about it were, in some documented cases, transferred. The falsification was not the work of a few rogue operators. It was a systematic institutional decision made at the highest levels of the military command structure and authorized at the level of the White House. When congressional investigators later examined the falsified records, they found not simply that the paper trail had been altered, but that the alteration had been done carefully and consistently enough to be difficult to reconstruct. The actual targets, the actual tonnage, the actual timing of strikes had been obscured sufficiently that producing an accurate account of what had happened required enormous investigative effort years after the fact. The people who had ordered the falsification understood that what they were doing was a profound violation of the legal framework that is supposed to govern how democracies conduct military operations. They did it anyway, and the institutional culture of the military protected the decision for years. The Special Operations Record from Vietnam contains material that is still only partially available to researchers, but what is available documents a pattern of operations that existed in a space between official policy and the absence of any meaningful oversight. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, known by the abbreviation that sounds deliberate in its blandness, conducted operations in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam throughout the war. These operations included direct action raids, reconnaissance missions, prisoner snatches, and activities that the public record still does not fully describe. The men who conducted them operated under rules of engagement that were distinct from those governing conventional forces, under a classification regime that insulated their activities from normal oversight, and under command arrangements that made accountability diffuse in ways that were not accidental. The Phoenix program, which targeted the Viet Cong infrastructure through a combination of intelligence gathering, capture operations, and what the program documentation described with clinical neutrality as neutralization, produced its own body count with its own reliability problems. The program operated through a network of provincial reconnaissance units, South Vietnamese paramilitary forces trained and supported by the CIA and American Special Operations personnel. The official accounting of the program claimed that large numbers of Viet Cong infrastructure members had been captured or killed. Internal assessments of who those people actually were, assessments conducted by the program's own management at various points, found that a significant portion of those counted as Viet Cong infrastructure members were in fact ordinary civilians caught up in a system that had structural incentives to produce high numbers regardless of the quality of the targeting. Quotas for neutralizations had been set at various levels of the program. Meeting quotas required producing numbers when the actual intelligence was insufficient to identify genuine targets required expanding the definition of who qualified as a target. This is the part of the record that requires the most careful language because the implications are very direct. There is documentation in the classified files, documentation from Phoenix Program Management itself, from province advisors, from congressional investigations, indicating that a program designed to destroy an enemy political organization was in practice killing and imprisoning people who had no meaningful connection to that organization, at a rate and in numbers that those running the program knew was occurring. The justifications offered in the internal record are not the justifications that appeared in public congressional testimony. The internal justifications were largely operational and institutional. The program had to produce numbers. The numbers had to go somewhere. And the targeting process could not be tightened enough to eliminate the problem without also reducing the numbers to a level that would not satisfy the program's political sponsors. The war's effect on the soldiers who fought it has been extensively documented in the public record, but the classified material adds dimensions that the public account has not fully incorporated. The Army's own internal studies of morale and discipline conducted throughout the war, but with particular intensity during the period from 1968 through 1972, document a deterioration that was understood within the institution as catastrophic, even while official statements about troop quality and morale continued to be optimistic. Drug use was not a phenomenon that crept up on the military and surprised its leadership. The classified record shows that drug availability and use rates were reported to senior commanders continuously, and that the scale of the problem was known with considerable precision years before it became a major subject of public discussion. The Army's own surveys, conducted through a combination of anonymous questionnaires and command reporting, estimated heroin use rates in Vietnam-based units that, if the numbers were accurate, indicated that a substantial fraction of the infantry force was addicted or regularly using during certain periods of the war. The institutional response to this knowledge was largely to manage the information rather than to address the conditions that produced it. Widespread drug use was in part a consequence of the particular texture of infantry service in Vietnam. The combination of extreme danger during operations and extreme boredom during base periods. The difficulty of maintaining motivation for a mission whose rationale had become unclear to many of the men conducting it. The rupture between the military culture that had trained these soldiers and the reality of the war they found when they arrived. The classified record shows commanders were aware that morale and unit cohesion were deteriorating. It also shows that the reporting required to surface this problem fully to decision-makers was systematically moderated on its way up the chain of command. The phenomenon of fragging, the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own soldiers, received sustained internal attention from the army during the later years of the war. The classified studies of this phenomenon contain findings that did not appear in the public record. The incidents were more numerous than was acknowledged officially, and the pattern of which officers were targeted suggested something systematic rather than random. Officers who ordered unnecessary tactical risks. Officers who maintained unrealistic expectations of combat performance from soldiers who were rotating near the end of their tours. Officers who were perceived as prioritizing their own career advancement over the safety of their men. These were disproportionately represented among those targeted. This does not transform fragging into anything other than what it was, a profound sign of institutional breakdown. But the pattern in the classified data suggests that the soldiers committing these acts were responding to something specific about the way the war was being commanded, and that the institution understood this and chose to treat the incidents as individual disciplinary problems rather than symptoms of a systemic condition. The classified record concerning the treatment of enemy prisoners in Vietnam requires attention because it documents conditions and practices that official policy prohibited and that the public record has consistently underrepresented. The Geneva Conventions, which the United States was formally committed to observe, established clear requirements for the treatment of prisoners of war. The classified record shows that these requirements were violated systematically, not occasionally, not by aberrant individuals, but as a pattern of conduct that was known to commanders at multiple levels and that was not effectively stopped. The most common category of violation involved the treatment of prisoners immediately following capture, before they could be transferred to formal prisoner handling facilities. Tactical interrogation in the field, conducted under pressure without oversight. In environments where the intelligence gained from a prisoner might have immediate operational value, produced conditions that the official policy framework would not have authorized. The classified investigations of specific incidents, investigations conducted by the military's own Inspector General and Judge Advocate systems, document individual cases in detail. What those individual cases taken together reveal is not a collection of isolated incidents, but a widespread pattern that the system was aware of and inadequately controlled. More difficult to document, but present in the record in ways that historians have only partially traced, are practices associated with the handling of prisoners through the South Vietnamese intelligence and security services. American advisors were present in facilities operated by South Vietnamese security services, where treatment of prisoners would not have met any reasonable interpretation of the Geneva Conventions. The classification of documents relating to those advisors' observations and reporting has made full historical accounting of this aspect of the war difficult. What is available indicates that American officials at multiple levels knew what was happening in those facilities, that some raised concerns, and that the institutional response was not to compel the South Vietnamese services to change their practices, but to manage American exposure to those practices in ways that reduced legal and political risk. There is a category of operational history concerning the ground war that involves the management of civilian casualties in ways that the classified record treats differently from the public record. The concept of free fire zones, areas where anyone present was presumed to be hostile and could be engaged without the procedural requirements that normally governed targeting decisions, was institutionalized early in the war and created conditions where civilian deaths were an expected operational outcome rather than an aberration. The internal records of how free fire zone designations were made, maintained, and expanded show a process in which operational convenience played a larger role than any rigorous assessment of whether the designation was accurate. Areas were designated free fire zones based on the logic that enemy forces operated there, which was often true, but also often meant that the civilian population that had lived there before the war and had not been evacuated was caught in a legal framework that made them invisible to the targeting system. After-action reports from operations in free fire zones, reports that are now partially available through declassification requests, contain descriptions of contact with what the reports categorize as enemy forces that are, in a significant number of cases, difficult to reconcile with what the subsequent investigation of the same incidents, where investigations occurred, found about the actual population of the area targeted. The gap between how the operational reporting categorized the people killed and what the investigative record says about who those people were is a gap the institution managed through classification, through limited investigation, and through the legal architecture of the free fire designation itself, which made the categorization available as a default defense. The My Lai investigation and the subsequent proceedings against participants are the most thoroughly documented instance of this pattern. But the classified record contains evidence that My Lai was not unique in kind, only in the scale of what occurred in a single incident and in the particular set of circumstances that caused it to reach investigation and prosecution. Reports of smaller incidents with similar characteristics, incidents involving the killing of civilians under conditions that did not meet the standards the official rules of engagement nominally required, were filed, classified, and in many cases not investigated further. The Army's own internal assessments produced in the aftermath of My Lai, assessments that examined incident reporting across the theater, concluded that the system for reporting and investigating suspected violations of the laws of war was inadequate, that underreporting was significant, and that the command climate in many units did not support soldiers who raised concerns about actions they had witnessed. Those internal assessments were themselves classified and were not available to the congressional investigations that were simultaneously examining the same question. The classified record concerning the air war's impact on civilians in South Vietnam is even less well incorporated into the public account than the ground war material, partly because the scale makes individual incidents harder to trace, and partly because the targeting decisions that produced civilian casualties were made at remove by crews who did not see the consequences of their strikes and by commanders who saw the results through the mediating layer of the damage assessment system. The B-52 arc light strikes, which saturated large areas of jungle and cultivated land with bombs on the basis of intelligence that indicated enemy presence in a defined zone, were operations in which the distinction between military targets and civilian infrastructure was not always clearly drawn, and in many cases could not be drawn, because the areas targeted contained both. The classified post-strike assessment materials from arc light operations, materials that have been only partially released, show a systematic pattern in which the intelligence that justified a strike was often of lower quality than the procedures nominally required, and in which the assessment of civilian casualties and infrastructure damage in the aftermath was cursory. The communities that existed in the areas struck, the villages and hamlets and agricultural settlements that had been present in South Vietnam for generations, do not appear with much frequency in the target planning documents. They were not invisible. They were categorized in a way that rendered their presence operationally irrelevant. If an area was designated as containing enemy forces or infrastructure, the presence of civilians was a secondary consideration within the framework of the targeting system as it actually operated. What the classified record shows about the upper levels of the American command structure during the most intense phases of the war is a picture of institutional paralysis rather than institutional direction. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam, under the successive commands of General Westmoreland and General Abrams, had a command structure that was enormous and elaborate, and that processed information continuously. The information that came out at the top, the assessments that shaped strategic decisions, bore the relationship to the information that went in at the bottom, that you would expect from a system designed to manage institutional reputation rather than to transmit accurate tactical and operational reality. The process of aggregation, the way patrol reports became unit reports, became command assessments, became MACV reporting to Washington, involved at each level a compression that lost detail and a professional pressure to present the situation in a way that was defensible upward. The planning documents that circulated within MACV headquarters, documents that were classified and some of which remain classified or only partially released, show an institution that was aware, at various levels, that the strategic theory underlying its operations was not producing the results it predicted. The search and destroy strategy that Westmoreland pursued was premised on attriting the enemy faster than he could replace his losses. The classified enemy order of battle assessments, the ones that conflicted with the numbers being officially reported, suggested that the attrition rate being achieved was not in fact outpacing enemy replacement. This was known within the intelligence structure. What the command documents show is not that this knowledge was absent, but that it was present and managed, compartmented, qualified, subordinated to the operational momentum of an institution that could not easily change course. Changing course would have required admitting that the strategy was wrong, which would have required admitting that the men who had designed and implemented the strategy had been wrong, which would have had consequences for careers, for institutional standing, for the political framework that justified the entire enterprise. The cost of admitting error was very high. The cost of continuing with a strategy that was not working was paid by the soldiers in the field and by the Vietnamese on all sides who lived in the areas where the strategy was being implemented. The accounting was asymmetric in ways that made continuation the path of least institutional resistance. The relationship between the military command and the civilian leadership in Washington is documented in ways that reveal how thoroughly both sides participated in the maintenance of an officially optimistic narrative that neither fully believed. The classified cable traffic between MACV in Saigon and the Pentagon and the White House shows a pattern in which McNamara and then Clark Clifford and then Melvin Laird asked pointed questions about progress that the military answered with data that was technically accurate in its individual elements and deeply misleading in its aggregate presentation. The civilian leadership had access to the CIA's independent assessments, which were consistently more pessimistic than the military's reporting. The classified record shows civilian decision-makers reviewing both sets of assessments, noting the discrepancy, and continuing to authorize operations on the basis of the more optimistic picture. The reasons for this are not simply epistemic. The political costs of acknowledging that the war was not being won were enormous, and they were costs that accrued to specific individuals at specific moments in political cycles. Lyndon Johnson's decision in 1968 not to seek re-election was preceded by months of privately expressed doubt about the war that did not appear in his public statements. The classified record of his conversations with his advisors in the period between the Tet Offensive and his withdrawal announcement shows a president who understood quite well that the public picture of the war did not match the private reality, and who found himself unable to bridge that gap in a way that was politically survivable. The decision not to seek re-election was, among other things, a decision to stop performing the act of public optimism that his political role had required of him. Nixon's continuation of the war, which he had promised to end during the campaign, is documented in the classified record in ways that reveal the logic of the continuation clearly. The Vietnamization strategy, the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while American troops were withdrawn, was designed to achieve a political outcome, an acceptable period of stability after American withdrawal, sufficient to provide what Nixon's advisors called a decent interval before whatever happened subsequently. The classified record contains explicit discussions of what that interval needed to look like and how long it needed to last for the political purposes it was meant to serve. The strategic aim was not Vietnamese independence or the preservation of South Vietnam as a viable state. It was the management of American domestic politics over a timeline that would insulate the Nixon administration from direct association with the outcome that most of the people in that administration privately expected. Kissinger's negotiating record, portions of which remain classified, shows a diplomatic process in which the American side was aware that the peace agreement being negotiated did not have the enforcement mechanisms necessary to make it durable, and that the assurances being given to South Vietnamese President Thieu about continued American support were assurances that the American negotiators had reasons to believe could not be kept. The agreement was concluded. The assurances were given. The support, when the moment of its necessity arrived, was not forthcoming, because the domestic political conditions that would have made it possible had been consumed by Watergate and by the congressional restrictions on further American military involvement that followed the revelations about Cambodia. There is a dimension of the classified record that concerns the long-term consequences of the war that is in some ways the most troubling of all, because it involves not what happened during the war, but what happened afterward, and what was known about what would happen during the period when decisions were still being made. The environmental consequences of herbicide use in Vietnam, particularly the use of Agent Orange and related dioxin-containing compounds, were matters of scientific uncertainty during the war, but matters that some of the scientists involved in the program understood to be potentially serious. The classified record contains scientific assessments from the 1960s that raised questions about the toxicity of the compounds being used at the scale they were being applied. Those assessments were classified. The program continued. The subsequent health consequences for American veterans exposed to those compounds, and for the Vietnamese civilians and combatants and the land itself that received the application of those compounds at far greater concentrations than veterans had encountered, were severe and persistent. The classified record of what was known during the program about potential health risks and how that knowledge was managed within the institutional framework that oversaw the program has been the subject of litigation and congressional inquiry for decades. What the available record shows is that the precautionary principle, the practice of stopping or limiting an activity when its potential harms are not yet fully understood, was not applied. The operational value of the defoliation program to the military's immediate objectives was judged to outweigh the uncertain but documented potential for long-term harm to the people exposed to it. The unexploded ordnance problem, the bombs and artillery shells and mines that did not detonate when they were intended to and that continued to kill and injure people in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia for decades after the fighting ended, is documented in the classified record with a thoroughness that contrasts sharply with its absence from American public consciousness. The due rates for various types of munitions were known during the war. The areas of highest contamination were mapped. The long-term consequences for agricultural land and for the populations who would continue to farm that land were calculable. None of this entered the operational calculus in ways that changed the scale or nature of the ordnance being employed. The people who would be killed by those unexploded munitions in the years and decades after the war ended were not part of the cost-benefit framework within which operational decisions were made. The classified record concerning the war in Laos, which was conducted simultaneously with the war in Vietnam, but almost entirely outside public awareness, involves not just the targeting decisions discussed earlier, but the entire political and military architecture of a parallel conflict that was, for the duration of its conduct, officially denied. The CIA's management of the Royal Lao Army and the Hmong irregular forces that bore much of the ground fighting in Laos, the Air America operation that supported those forces, the extensive American bombing campaign against both the Ho Chi Minh Trail and against Pathet Lao positions constituted a war that was as large and as lethal in its immediate geography as many acknowledged conflicts. The people of Laos, particularly the Hmong who fought on the American side, were exposed to extraordinary levels of violence over years, and then, when the political calculations changed, were largely abandoned. The classified record of what American officials knew would happen to those populations after American support ended and what decisions were made in light of that knowledge, is a document about the distance between operational commitments and the obligations that most moral frameworks would say follow from those commitments. The treatment of the Hmong after the war ended falls outside the direct scope of the war itself, but the record of what was known and when is relevant to understanding the nature of the decisions that were made during the war. American officials who managed the Laos operation knew by the early 1970s that the conflict's likely conclusion would leave their local allies in an extremely dangerous position. That knowledge did not alter the fundamental decision to continue using those allies for American operational purposes until the moment when American involvement ended. The classified discussions of what obligations the United States had to those populations, discussions that occurred within the agencies that had recruited and managed them, show an institutional framework that was capable of identifying the moral problem, but not of resolving it in a way that would have incurred significant operational or political costs. There is a final dimension of the classified record that concerns not specific operations or specific policy decisions, but the internal assessment process itself, the way the institution responsible for conducting the war evaluated its own performance. The classified study that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, which Daniel Ellsberg removed and provided to the New York Times in 1971, was itself an internal assessment commissioned by McNamara, in part because he had concluded that the public record of the war's history and the classified record were sufficiently different that someone needed to understand what had actually happened. The study, which ran to several thousand pages and covered the period from Truman through the early Johnson administration, reached conclusions about the war's origins and conduct that were significantly at odds with what the public and the Congress had been told. What Ellsberg's decision to release the study revealed was not simply that the government had kept secrets, which was expected, but that the government had maintained a parallel account of history, a classified account that its own analysts found more accurate, while simultaneously constructing and defending a public account that they knew was incomplete and in significant respects false. The revelation was not primarily about any specific policy decision documented in the papers. It was about the existence of the gap itself, the institutionalized practice of maintaining two histories, the public one and the classified one, and allowing the public one to shape political debate, while the classified one sat in safes where its uncomfortable findings could not disturb the official narrative. Nixon's response to the publication was to prosecute Ellsberg, to attempt through the courts and through extra-legal means to prevent further publication, and to conduct the surveillance and harassment operations against perceived enemies that eventually contributed to his own downfall. The prosecution failed. The publications continued. The gap between the classified and the public record became, for a period, a matter of sustained public attention, and then, gradually, the gap reclosed. Subsequent administrations returned to the practice of managing the classified record in ways that insulated public understanding from the full range of what was known and documented. The institutional mechanisms that had produced the gap in the first place were not eliminated. They adapted. The soldiers who came home from Vietnam and tried to describe what they had seen often found that the description did not fit into any available framework that the public was prepared to receive. The public frameworks for understanding the war, the patriotic framework and the anti-war framework and the tragic misunderstanding framework all had something in common. They all required the war to have a meaning, either the meaning of justified sacrifice or the meaning of justified protest or the meaning of a noble effort that went wrong. What many veterans reported in the oral histories that were collected in the years after the war, in the therapy sessions whose records have partially entered the historical record, in the literature that emerged from the veteran community over subsequent decades, was something different from meaning. What they reported was a quality of experience that resisted the meaning frameworks available to them. A war that had felt from the inside less like a coherent project gone wrong and more like a grinding, purposeless, daily contact with violence and death, in an environment where the normal markers of progress and purpose and human significance were absent. The classified psychological assessments that the military conducted on returning veterans, assessments that fed into the understanding of what would eventually be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder, documented the specific features of Vietnam that distinguished it from previous American combat experience in ways relevant to psychological outcome. The absence of clear front lines, the inability to distinguish enemy from civilian, the rotation system that sent individuals in and out of combat zones on individual schedules that prevented the formation of cohesive unit bonds that had characterized previous wars, the absence of territorial objectives whose capture would mark progress, the quality of being in a war whose political rationale was contested and unclear. These features were documented in the classified literature as psychologically significant. The institution that had created those conditions had known they were psychologically significant, had known it from early in the war, when initial assessments were conducted, and had not altered the fundamental structure of service in response to that knowledge, because the structure served other institutional needs more pressing than the psychological well-being of the individuals within it. The one-year rotation system is worth dwelling on, because it appears repeatedly in the classified record as something that senior commanders understood to have negative consequences for unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. And that persisted anyway, because it served the institutional purpose of distributing combat experience across the officer corps. If the war was going to last long enough to be a career-defining experience, and by the middle 1960s it was clearly going to last that long, then the Army needed a system that gave as many officers as possible their combat ticket. The 12-month tour accomplished that. It also meant that experienced soldiers were continuously leaving units just as they had accumulated the knowledge and relationships that made them effective, to be replaced by inexperienced soldiers who would themselves be gone in 12 months. The unit, as a learning institution, was structurally prevented from retaining what it learned. The classified studies that documented this consequence were filed alongside the decisions that maintained the system. The question of what the United States was actually trying to accomplish in Vietnam, the question of strategic purpose, is one that the classified record answers in a way that is both more specific and more unsatisfying than the public record suggests. The domino theory, the idea that the fall of South Vietnam would trigger a cascade of communist victories across Southeast Asia, was the public rationale. The classified record contains internal assessments, dating from early in the American involvement, that questioned whether the domino theory accurately described the political dynamics of the region. Intelligence assessments from the early 1960s found that the countries most often cited as potential dominoes had political situations considerably more complex than the domino theory implied, that communist movements in those countries had their own national characters and were not simply extensions of a monolithic international communist project, and that the fall of South Vietnam would not necessarily translate into the political transformations the theory predicted. Those assessments were produced, they were read, they were contested by other assessments that supported the theory. The debate within the classified system continued throughout the period of American involvement without producing a resolution, because the theory served political and institutional purposes regardless of its empirical accuracy, and abandoning it would have required constructing a different justification for a commitment that had already acquired its own momentum. By the late 1960s, the internal discussion of American strategic purpose had shifted from the domino theory to something considerably more candid and considerably more troubling. The classified planning documents from this period contain discussions of American credibility as the primary strategic interest at stake, the idea that the United States could not afford to be seen as losing a conflict to which it had committed substantial forces, not because of what losing would mean for Vietnam or Southeast Asia specifically, but because of what it would mean for the global perception of American resolve. The war had to continue, not because winning was achievable, but because the consequences of losing, measured in terms of international perceptions of American reliability, were judged to be severe. This argument, that the war needed to continue in order to protect American credibility, even in the absence of a plausible path to winning, appears in the classified record with increasing frequency as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s. It was an argument made explicitly by McNamara in internal documents before his public break with the administration, an argument he found deeply troubling even as he was making it. The logic led somewhere he could not go publicly, that the lives being spent in Vietnam were being spent primarily to manage an abstraction called credibility, in a war that the people managing it did not believe could be won, conducted according to a strategy that their own analysts told them was not working, in pursuit of a political structure, the South Vietnamese government, that their own advisors told them was not viable. The private documents show this knowledge clearly. The public statements show something else. What the archive shows, accumulated across years and across the full range of its contents, is the structure of a lie that was not quite a lie. The people who made the decisions were not, for the most part, simply cynical actors who knew the truth and said the opposite. They were people inside an institutional structure that systematically filtered the truth in one direction, that rewarded the production of optimistic information, that imposed professional costs on those who reported accurately when accuracy was inconvenient, and that had created, through years of operation, a system in which the people at the top received a picture of the war that bore a specific, consistent, predictable relationship to reality, a relationship in which every negative indicator had been compressed, every positive indicator had been amplified, and the aggregate result was a picture of a war being managed toward an achievable outcome, when the underlying reality was a war whose outcome the institution had, in many respects, already stopped being able to effect. The soldiers who are documented in the classified record as having raised concerns, as having submitted accurate reports that were subsequently altered, as having attempted to report violations that were subsequently not investigated, were not primarily idealists or crusaders. They were professionals trying to do their jobs in a system that made doing their jobs honestly difficult. The record does not support a reading of them as heroes in the cinematic sense. It supports a reading of them as individuals who encountered the gap between what they were supposed to report and what they were actually seeing, and who made various choices about how to navigate that gap, some of which involved honesty, and most of which eventually involved accommodation. The accommodation was not always conscious. Institutional pressure operates partly through the explicit reward and punishment systems that the record documents clearly, but also through subtler mechanisms, through the professional language that shapes how situations are described before they are reported, through the categories available in the reporting system that determine what can be said and what cannot, through the daily immersion in a command culture that treats certain kinds of information as legitimate and certain other kinds as problematic. The soldiers and officers who produced inaccurate reports were not uniformly aware that their reports were inaccurate. The system produced inaccuracy structurally, and individual actors within the system absorbed its categories and its norms in ways that made the production of inaccurate information feel like the performance of their professional roles. The classified record ends, as all records end, in the middle of things. The war itself did not end on April 30th, 1975, in any sense except the immediately operational one. The physical conflict in Vietnam continued at various levels of intensity for years afterward, in the form of border conflicts, internal suppression of resistance, the occupation of Cambodia, the conflict with China in 1979. The psychological and medical consequences of the American involvement continued, in the veteran population and in the Vietnamese population, for decades in ways that are still being documented. The political consequences, the restructuring of American civil-military relations, the War Powers Act, the congressional restrictions on executive authority to commit military force, the deep institutional suspicion between the military and large segments of the civilian population, all of these were ongoing processes rather than concluded events. The last entries in the classified files from Saigon, the cables and assessments that were transmitted in the days before the final evacuation, have a quality of compressed factual statement that strips away the institutional optimism that had characterized the reporting for so long. By then, there was no longer any purpose to be served by the optimism. The assessments were accurate because accuracy no longer threatened anyone's career or contradicted any policy anyone was still defending. The forces were collapsing. The government was not viable. The outcome that had been privately expected for years was occurring on the public stage. The cables said so plainly. And then the evacuation was complete, and the cables stopped, and the classified record closed on that chapter. And the institutional machinery that had produced the distortions and the falsifications and the managed assessments continued to operate in other theaters and other conflicts, carrying with it the practices and the incentive structures and the professional cultures that the Vietnam experience had neither created nor destroyed, because those things were not products of the war, but of the institutions that had conducted it, and those institutions continued. The last American combat deaths in the Vietnam War occurred during the evacuation of Saigon in April 1975. The last deaths attributable to unexploded ordnance from the war in Laos were recorded decades later. The institutional assessments that described the final collapse of the South Vietnamese government were filed, classified at various levels, and stored in facilities where they joined the earlier assessments that had described the war as progressing toward a different outcome. The files remained. The war had ended. The filing continued.